Just 12 minutes after takeoff, the aircraft suffered a terrifying explosion due to a sudden loss of cabin pressure. The tail section was instantly destroyed by the pressure difference between the cabin and the outside. This rendered the entire control system useless. After 33 minutes of desperately fighting fate, the plane crashed into a mountain. Based on tens of thousands of investigative reports and accurately recovered black box data, I will now reconstruct the full scene of the accident, the deadliest crash of a single aircraft in history. August 12, 1985, Haneda International Airport, Tokyo. It was the peak travel time in Japan, as people returned home for Obon. The aircraft, with registration number J8119, a Boeing 747S operated by Japan Airlines, was preparing for flight number 123 from Tokyo to Osaka. On that day, this aircraft had already completed 4 of a total of 6 scheduled flights. During the 1970s, Japan's aviation industry was booming. The standard Boeing 747s often couldn't meet the rising passenger demand. In response to Japan's request, Boeing developed the 747-100SR, a short-range variant designed for domestic flights. It reduced fuel capacity to increase seating capacity. As a result, the 747SR could carry up to 522 passengers, compared to 366 on the standard version. Its fuselage and landing gear were also reinforced to handle the demands of frequent takeoffs and landings. On domestic routes in Japan, Flight 123's crew included 3 men. In the left cockpit seat was First Officer Sasaki Yu, 39 years old, undergoing training to become a captain. He needed to gain experience under supervision. In the right seat was Captain Takahama Masaki, 49 years old, the supervising pilot on this flight. He was a veteran instructor at the airline, with over 12,000 flight hours, and no prior incidents in more than 15 years of flying Boeing 747s. Seated behind them was flight engineer Fukuda Hiroshi, with 9,831 flight hours, responsible for monitoring the engine, fuel, and hydraulic systems. Because the 747-100SR still required all 3 pilots were core members of the crew at Japan Airlines, highly experienced and highly skilled. The Tokyo-Osaka route was one of the busiest domestic routes in Japan. Flight 123 that day was nearly fully booked, carrying 509 passengers. Among them was the 4-member Kawakami family, who had just finished a vacation in Hokkaido and were heading to Osaka to visit friends. Due to a cancellation, they were lucky to get on the standby list and boarded the flight. Also on board was actress Yumiko's son, who had just landed a lead role in a new drama, and passenger Yoshida Yumiko. During the holiday season, many people were returning to Kansai to see family, to visit relatives. Murakami Ryo, who lived in Chiba, was traveling alone for work in Osaka. As for Mr. Taniguchi Masakatsu, after attending a funeral in Tokyo, he decided to take this flight, which he usually disliked, just to get home to loved ones sooner. At 1812 local time, Flight 123 took off from runway 15L of Tokyo International Airport, though a few minutes behind schedule. Lifting the 239-ton aircraft into the sky. After flying over Tokyo Bay, the aircraft began a right turn to continue toward Osaka. Due to the short route, the cruising altitude was set at just 24,000 feet, or about 7,300 meters. As the plane climbed higher, the outside air grew thinner. To ensure the pilots and passengers could breathe normally, the pressurization system activated from the moment the aircraft started taxiing. As the plane gained altitude, the cabin pressure gradually increased. The external pressure creates a pressure differential. The pressurized cabin acts like an inflated balloon pushing outward when descending or preparing to land. The cabin pressure is released through an outflow valve, making it behave like a deflating balloon, starting to shrink. The continuous pressurization and depressurization over time causes the fuselage to suffer from metal fatigue. To accommodate the repeated takeoffs and landings on domestic flights in Japan, the 747-100SR had its fuselage structure reinforced. Over 11 years of operation, this aircraft had gone through 18,835 takeoff, landing cycles. However, no one suspected a critical defect had silently persisted for years on that very aircraft. Let's go back 7 years earlier. This same aircraft, while operating Japan Airlines Flight 115, encountered a serious incident. While landing at Atami Airport in Osaka, the tail section struck the runway hard. The impact damaged the rear bulkhead, along with the fire-resistant wall near the APU auxiliary power unit compartment. Boeing dispatched a team of over 40 to repair and inspect the aircraft. During the repair process, technicians used rivets to attach the new lower bulkhead to the undamaged upper portion. However, a quality control engineer noticed that the rivet holes in section L-18 of the lower bulkhead exceeded the allowable standard. To fix this, the engineer recommended a new solution, installing a single-piece bulkhead patch in the problem area to ensure structural integrity and eliminate gaps at the rivets. But during actual implementation, the repair team used 2 smaller plates, joined side by side, with an old spacer inserted between them. Using 2 separate plates, instead of a single solid one, caused the stress, which should have been distributed across 2 rows of rivets, to concentrate on just 1 row. As a result, section L-18 strength was reduced to only about 70% of its original design specification. After the repair was completed, the quality control engineer failed to detect the flaws that arose during rework. The aircraft was approved to return to service. In all subsequent inspections, up until the disaster occurred, section L-18 was never examined separately. The reason? The manufacturer believed that the 747 structure had never shown any cracks in that area, so only periodic visual inspections were needed to check for corrosion. For 7 years since that repair, the aircraft went through 12,319 takeoff, landing cycles. Each time the pressure was compressed and released, it further weakened the life of section L-18. That deadly danger was like a ticking time bomb, silently hanging beneath the fuselage throughout its years of operation, until August 12th, the clock of fate finally ticked down to 0. At 1822, Flight 123 entered the airspace over the Izu Peninsula. Mr. Ogawa, seated on the right side of the cabin, took out his camera and captured a shot of the wing, with Mount Fuji in the distant background. 2 minutes later, a flight attendant used the intercom to ask the cockpit if a passenger could go to the restroom. But just 17 seconds after the call ended, a loud boom suddenly erupted from the rear of the aircraft. The captain immediately concluded the sound was caused by a pressure explosion. He immediately entered emergency code 7700 into the transponder. Air traffic control instantly received the emergency signal from Flight 123. After checking the engine, the crew found nothing abnormal. They had no idea that the loud noise had come from the rupture of the rear pressure bulkhead, caused compressed air in the cabin to burst out violently, completely destroying the auxiliary power unit, APU, as well as most of the vertical stabilizer and the aircraft's directional control. At the time of the explosion, Bakawakami Keiko, seated in 60D, the last row, was one of the survivors. She recalled that she felt a sharp pain in her ears, followed by a thick white mist rushing in from the front of the cabin. All the oxygen masks above their heads dropped down instantly. These phenomena were direct results of the plane losing pressure suddenly due to the ruptured bulkhead. Inside the cockpit, Captain Takahama instructed the co-pilot to turn back to Haneda Airport. After receiving permission from air traffic control, the co-pilot steered the aircraft to the right. However, the captain noticed the aircraft was banking much more sharply than it normally would, nearly 180 degrees. The co-pilot was ordered to tilt the control column left to reduce the bank angle, but the aircraft responded with unusual sluggishness. At this point, engineer Fukuda realized that pressure in the hydraulic system was dropping rapidly. The 747 State Route 100 aircraft was equipped with 4 separate hydraulic systems to operate the control surfaces, allowing full control over its movement in 3 axes: pitch, roll, and yaw. However, all the hydraulic lines ran through the rear of the aircraft. The explosion destroyed all of these lines, causing hydraulic fluid to begin leaking from the damaged areas. The system controlling the flight surfaces gradually lost function. No matter how the pilots manipulated the control column, They couldn't regain control. The aircraft had completely lost all steering power. This was effectively a death sentence for Flight 123. At 1827, Flight 123 flew past the Izu Peninsula and entered the airspace over Suruga Bay. All of the aircraft's hydraulic systems were paralyzed. The pressure gauges had all dropped to zero. There were no vertical stabilizers or rudder control left. The horizontal stability of the aircraft sharply leading to a rocking motion from side to side, which the pilots couldn't control. This phenomenon is known as Dutch roll, also called Dutch roll oscillation. Under normal conditions, the aircraft uses a yaw damper system to minimize these oscillations. But on Flight 123, the rudder was completely destroyed in the explosion, meaning the yaw damper system also became useless. Moreover, most of the vertical stabilizer was lost, making the side-to-side oscillations increasingly severe, accompanied by fugoid motions, uncontrollable vertical oscillations. Due to lift forces, the aircraft started pitching upward automatically, but as it climbed higher, lift decreased and the aircraft descended. As it descended, lift increased again, causing the aircraft to pitch back up. This created a repetitive cycle of movements, similar to a roller coaster, causing passengers to panic. Mr. Taniguchi Masakazu, seated in seat 48C, took a sanitary bag from the plane and with trembling hands wrote his final words to his family while the plane shook violently. Machiko, please take care of our children. Osaka, Mino, 6:30. Sitting immediately to his right in seat 48D, Mr. Murakami Ryohi wrote on a company envelope. The plane is shaking violently. 1830, rapidly descending. I might die. Everyone, please live well. Goodbye. At flight attendant position E1, MS, Susuma Yuko wrote in her notebook instructions and necessary announcement scripts in case of an emergency landing. Sitting in seat 22H, Mr. Kawaguchi Hiratsugu, with shaking hands, also wrote down his final words, addressed to his family. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots were still struggling to maneuver the aircraft back to Haneda Airport after the decompression incident occurred at an altitude of 24,000 feet, about 7,300 meters. The oxygen concentration inside the cabin fell to about 1/3 compared to ground level. However, the pilots did not immediately put on oxygen masks. They focused their entire attention and effort on saving the aircraft from losing control. After passing Suruga Bay, Flight 123 entered the airspace of Shizuoka Prefecture. The aircraft started gently turning to the right. But with the control system completely disabled, how could the plane change direction? Based on engine thrust data recovered from the FDR flight data recorder, it was found that engines number 1 and 4 on the outer wings generated uneven thrust. Engine number 1 on the left generated significantly more thrust than engine number 4 on the right. This indicated the flight crew had used differential thrust between engines to steer the aircraft, a technique they had never been formally trained to use in an emergency situation. Thus, relying solely on their years of flying experience, the crew attempted to steer the aircraft back towards Tokyo. At 1831, Tokyo Air Traffic Control asked the crew if they could divert to land at Nagoya Airport, 72 nautical miles away, about 133 kilometers. However, perhaps Captain Takahama considered that rescue and support capabilities at Haneda Airport were more comprehensive than at Nagoya, so he still requested to return to Tokyo. When a decompression incident occurs, the aircraft must urgently descend below an altitude of 10,000 feet, about 3,000 meters, to ensure passengers have enough oxygen to breathe. However, Flight 123 remained trapped in a spontaneous cycle of climbing and descending at altitudes between 23,000 and 25,000 feet, about 7,000 to 7,600 meters. Engineer Fukuda was informed by a flight attendant that the oxygen masks in the R5 area of the passenger cabin were broken and non-functional, faced with a situation threatening passengers' lives. At 1837, Flight 123 was flying past the western side of Mount Fuji. The flight crew had tried various methods, but still couldn't reduce altitude. At this point, Engineer Fukuda suggested to the captain to lower the landing gear to create drag, forcing the plane to descend. This was a correct decision. Considering the current loss of control, they had no choice but to apply unconventional methods to regain control of the aircraft. The landing gear of a Boeing 747 SR-100 can be gravity dropped when the hydraulic system completely fails. The first officer at 1840, all 5 landing gears were deployed and safely locked at 23,000 feet. Reality proved that engineer Fukuda's judgment was completely accurate. After the landing gear was deployed, Flight 123 finally started descending. The spontaneous vertical oscillations also decreased significantly. The first officer continued using the asymmetric thrust technique between engines to maintain the right turn. Flight 123 circled over Suki City's airspace, gradually descending from 24,000 feet to 15,000 feet. During this descent from 7,300 meters to about 4,500 meters, the crew utilized engine thrust adjustment techniques to navigate and seemed to partially regain control of the aircraft. They began heading towards Haneda Airport. However, from 1846 onwards, the aircraft suddenly began turning left uncontrollably. The reason might have been due to the altitude drop, causing changes in wind direction and speed. That afternoon, over Saitama Prefecture's sky, a single-cell thunderstorm had formed. A single-cell thunderstorm, moving southwest at a speed of about 30 kilometers per hour. At that moment, Flight 123 was near the leading edge of the thunderstorm. Due to the influence of southwest winds blowing from the sea and storm effects, the plane was pushed off its course, gradually drifting northwest. Captain Takahama reconfirmed with engineer Fukuda that all hydraulic systems had completely failed. Then he muttered quietly to himself. By 1847, Flight 123 finally descended below 10,000 feet, about 3,000 meters. Thanks to richer oxygen concentration at this altitude, passengers escaped oxygen deprivation, reducing physical and mental stress. However, the view through the cockpit windshield sent chills down their spines. The Kanto Mountains, towering and stretching. Captain Takahama clearly knew the rugged mountains ahead, and that opportunities were running out. The mountain dangers became increasingly evident. Although the first officer exerted full force to turn the control column right, the aircraft was completely uncontrollable. The plane was like a paper airplane, drifting helplessly with the forces of nature, heading straight toward deep mountain ranges. Meanwhile, Mr. Yamazaki Keiichi, who lived in the mountainous area of Okudama, suddenly heard aircraft engines. Although his house wasn't under any flight path, out of curiosity, he grabbed his camera and captured several photos of Flight 123. By this point, the aircraft was damaged. From the photographs, the plane's vertical stabilizer was almost entirely gone, and the landing gear was clearly deployed. These accidental images later became vital evidence in the accident investigation. At 7,000 feet, about 2,100 meters, Flight 123 continued descending. Facing the mountain range ahead, the captain ordered the first officer to increase thrust, aiming for a higher altitude. When thrust was pushed to maximum, the aircraft began climbing at a 20-degree angle. Although altitude increased due to the steep angle, airspeed rapidly dropped toward stall speed. The captain asked the first officer to push the control column forward to reduce pitch, but the plane completely lost its responsiveness. The first officer had to reduce thrust for the aircraft to descend. At this point, Flight 123 was flying through mountainous terrain averaging over 1,500 meters. But to ensure there was enough oxygen in the cabin to keep everyone alive, the aircraft needed to stay below 3,000 meters. The space in which the crew could maneuver was only about 1,000 meters. With pitch control completely lost, the crew could only use engine thrust to adjust the altitude. However, climbing too steeply risked causing a stall. At this point, the situation became extremely difficult. After a sharp dive, the crew adjusted the engines to maximum thrust. The aircraft was now climbing at a pitch of 40 degrees. The sudden climb caused the airspeed to drop rapidly. The control column began shaking violently, warning of an imminent stall. The stall caused the aircraft to fall rapidly. Outside the cockpit, the view shifted from golden sunset light on the sky above to the dark abyss of mountain valleys below. The crew of Flight 123 was now above a mountain range more than 70 kilometers from Tokyo, still bravely fighting against fate. At 1850, While the aircraft continued to oscillate up and down, facing the risk of stalling, they fully understood that, if they wanted to save the aircraft, they couldn't just sit and wait for fate. Engineer Fukuda suggested deploying the flaps. This would help increase lift and reduce the risk of stalling. With the hydraulic system failed, the 747 aircraft could still use electrical power to operate the flaps. The crew turned on the backup electrical power for the flaps. The flaps, now electrically controlled, began extending slowly at a very gradual pace. As the flaps deployed, lift gradually increased. During this process, the first officers seemed to have found a way to control the aircraft, to climb and descend more effectively. Flight 123 no longer oscillated violently like a glider. Even the Dutch roll phenomenon was significantly reduced. Amid countless challenges, the flight crew finally saw a ray of hope to return to the airport. However, the crew could not determine precisely their current location and began sending distress signals to the control center. At Tokyo Air Traffic Control, Flight 123 was approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Haneda Airport and began flying more steadily. This was likely related to the gradual deployment of the flaps. However, the flaps themselves became a double-edged sword. No one expected that. The right flap of the aircraft extended only to position 10 and then stopped. Meanwhile, the left flap continued extending. This uneven flap deployment was similar to the effect of trim tabs and caused more lift on the left side. More lift was generated, causing the aircraft to roll to the right. Both the captain and first officer recognized the issue of flap asymmetry. Since the flaps were electrically controlled, the process of retracting and extending was very slow. By the time the left flap fully extended, the aircraft had rolled to the right by 70 degrees. At this angle, the wings could no longer generate enough lift to keep the aircraft stable, causing it to. Flight 123's rate of descent at this point exceeded 18,000 feet per minute, over 5,400 meters per minute. Desperate screams rang out in the cockpit. The number 4 engine on the right detached when it struck trees shortly after. The aircraft continued to collide with its right wing at a 70-degree angle. The strong impact flipped the aircraft forward. All engines detached from the fuselage. At 18 hours 56 minutes and 26 seconds, Flight 123 crashed into the Takatenbara mountain range. The following is a broadcast report. A Japan Airlines aircraft, carrying about 500 passengers, on a flight from Tokyo to Osaka has disappeared from radar. The safety status of the flight is still unknown. According to Japan Airlines, Flight 123 took off from Haneda Airport at around 1800 hours, with 494 passengers on board, using a Boeing 747 aircraft. The exact location of signal loss has not been confirmed. According to U.S. military sources, in an area about 35 of Yokotai Air Base, approximately 60 kilometers near Tomioka City, in Gunma Prefecture, a forest fire was spotted. Authorities are actively verifying the situation. After Flight 123 disappeared from radar, Japan Air Self-Defense Force dispatched 2 F-4 fighter jets to the scene for confirmation. Around 1915, a U.S. military C-130 transport aircraft reported it had detected a forest fire at a location about 35 nautical miles from Yokotai Tower at a 305-degree bearing. About an hour and a half later, a rescue helicopter from the Japan Air Self-Defense Force arrived at the crash site. According to the statements of 4 survivors, they heard the sound of helicopters shortly after the crash, but the helicopters stayed briefly and then left. They also heard or sensed the presence of other survivors. According to the rescue helicopter captain, the crash site was burning intensely. After searching, they could not find a suitable landing site for rescue, so they returned to base. At exactly 2200 hours the same day, Japan Airlines established an emergency response team at a Tokyo hotel near Haneda Airport. Just 3 hours after the crash, the crash site had still not been clearly identified. Japan Air Self-Defense Force announced the location as Mount Oza, about 7 kilometers northwest of Mount Takatenbara. This incorrect information led to mistaken directions in the initial rescue efforts. At the time, due to the Obon holiday, many staff at the Prime Minister's office of Japan had gone home for the holiday. It wasn't until 4 hours after the crash that the Prime Minister's office held the Meeting of the investigation committee. Police, fire departments, and the military all agreed that nighttime search efforts were very difficult to avoid secondary injuries. During the search, they proposed waiting until 4 a.m. the next day before dispatching helicopters to search. In the official accident report, the night was described as one during which the air, self-defense force and ground forces searched continuously from August 12th to August 13th. However, a 1995 article in the Pacific Stars and Stripes revealed that the pilot of the C-130 aircraft, Mr. Michael Antonucci, who was the first to locate the crash site, was ordered to return to base immediately because the Japanese rescue team had begun operations. After returning, he was told not to share the information with the media. He also stated that the ground forces of Japan stopped searching at midnight and set up camp in Bueno Village. Soon after, 3 more survivors were found. All 4 survivors were seated at the rear of the plane, where the impact force was weakest during the crash. They survived thanks to their strong willpower. Had the crash site been located earlier, the rescue could have started sooner, and more passengers might have been saved. Ultimately, the cause of the Flight 123 accident was determined to be improper repairs after the Osaka accident in 1978, which led to the development of metal fatigue cracks. These cracks were the primary cause of the sudden decompression on board the aircraft. The hydraulic pipes were destroyed in the explosion, causing the aircraft to completely lose control. It became impossible to perform any flight maneuvers as intended by the captain. After thorough research, the investigation team concluded that a safe landing, or emergency water landing, was nearly impossible. After the crash, Boeing revised the hydraulics and added safety devices to ensure that the hydraulic system would not be entirely disabled in case of failure. After the investigation concluded, 4 police officers from Gunma Prefecture traveled to the U.S. to conduct a criminal investigation on the repair personnel involved. However, the U.S. side refused to cooperate, causing the investigation to stall. Eventually, the Japanese government decided not to prosecute the 44 repair staff. To this day, the Flight 123 disaster remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in the world. In terms of fatalities, the eldest daughter of Captain Masaki Takahama, MS Takahama Yoko, whose father gave his all to save the plane until the last moment, later became a flight attendant for Japan Airlines. She carried on her father's wish to continue ensuring the safety of every passenger in the sky.